Hello and welcome. My name is Alex Romero with Galasso Learning Solutions. On this week's Genuine Learning blog, we'll be looking at the 2025 AICPA Regional Council meetings that took place the week of March 17th and also the UAA's recent exposure draft. The annual Regional Council meetings are kind of a whirlwind of a week for the AICPA leadership team. There are 4 meetings over 4 days in 4 cities across the U.S., each of them having the same agenda. So they start off in New York City on Tuesday, followed by Chicago on Wednesday, then Los Angeles on Friday, and finishing up in Dallas on Friday. So being from Colorado, I was assigned the meeting in sunny California with other Western states. The regional meetings are closed to the media, so I'm only going to be sharing a general overview of what the agenda was. So some of the topics that we covered was that we first heard a professional update from Mark Koziel. This was his first as the AICPA's new CEO, and since this was Mark's first meeting, we had an opportunity to ask him some questions so that we all got to know each other a little bit better. I was one of the lucky ones that did know him when he oversaw the Leadership Academy for the AICPA, so it's wonderful to see him back and in this role. After lunch, we had tabletop discussions about the UAA's exposure draft and how it's going to impact our states. All the attendees were sat at tables with multiple states, so this was a wonderful way to hear some different perspectives and ideas from states that are close to you. So I had at my table 2 others from Colorado, a few from Utah, and some from Nevada. The last thing that we covered were the items that we are going to be bringing to our state senators and representatives when we are on the Hill in DC at the Spring Council meeting this May. And one thing that you will get used to as I do these council updates are the pictures that I like to include of the wonderful people I get to connect with at these council meetings. So this time I have 2 pictures here. I have our Colorado council members with our COCPA CEO, Alicia Gelinas, and then also the AICPA CEO, Mark Koziel. And then I have a picture with the current AICPA chair, Carla McCall, who always brings great energy to these meetings. Now we're going to move into the Uniform Accountancies Act Exposures Draft. This project would amend the UAA Section 5 education requirements to sit for the CPA exam and education requirements for certificates, and also the UAA Section 23 practice privileges for individual mobility. This exposure draft was issued on March 4th, 2025, so it's still pretty fresh. For anyone that has been following the pipeline conversation and the CPA pathway options, you all know that there is a lot of background here. But I'm just going to highlight what we did see previously were those proposed changes that came out in September 2024 with the request for comments on those proposed changes. So following the conclusion of that comment period on December 30th, 2024, the organizations had received 194 stakeholder submissions. So a lot of people had a lot to say here. Now that comprised of 124 comments from individuals. So this included educators, students, maybe some candidates, other stakeholders. There were 7 comments that came from CPA firms, 39 comments that came from state CPA societies. And I know that I personally was involved in the one that was submitted from Colorado. And that was actually a 17-page response. So if they were all that long, you can only imagine how much information they received. And then lastly, they also had 24 comments from the state boards of accountancy. So from all these comments, there really were 2 key themes that emerged. There was a strong desire for an additional pathway to CPA licensure and also a broad support for having individual-based mobility. So this would mean a transition from mobility being based on state substantial equivalency to a model based on individual licensing criteria. which I don't know about for anybody else, but this is kind of mind-blowing. I feel like I have heard about substantial equivalency for so long that hearing about individual mobility is just a new concept. So let's take a look at that. So what would be some of the Section 5 proposed updates? Well, it's going to include 3 different pathways. The first one is going to be having that post-bachelor's degree plus 1 year's experience and passing the CPA license. The next is having that bachelor's degree plus 30 credit hours, 1 year's of experience and passing the CPA. So those are the 2 that we are familiar with. And then the new one that's been added is a bachelor's degree with 2 years of experience and passing the CPA exam. So the experience is going to need to include providing any type of services or advice that's going to involve the use of accounting, ad test, compilation, management advisory, financial advisory, tax, or consulting skills, all of which may be supervised by a non-licensee, but it must be verified by a licensee. This experience can be gained through employment in government, in industry, academia, or public practice. Also here we see that candidates are able to sit for the CPA exam once they have earned that bachelor's degree with that accounting concentration. And I will note that all of those requirements in the 3 pathways do mention that the bachelor's degree has to have that accounting concentration. I just didn't write that because that's kind of a long word there for our bullets. Now with our Section 23 proposed updates, these are going to include allowing the CPA to practice across state lines with only 1 license. So mobility will be individually based and streamlined. So this kind of brings in some different thoughts and questions about mobility. If a state is wanting to fully adopt what the UAA changes are here, if they are actually adopted and put forward, a state could do that. But we do have some states that have already started working on licensure legislation that might align, or it might differ from these proposed UAA changes and their model. If there are going to be differences, you would really need to look at what those guardrails are going to be by the states, what were their different pathways. And it's important to think about what your state might have already been doing or what they're planning to do in the future, and if it's going to align with these changes if they do go through. So some of the implications for states is thinking about having those legislation updates. So states will need to review their accountancy laws and determine if they would want to align with these new UAA proposed provisions. We also need to think about regulatory adjustments. So state boards of accountancy may need to update their rules and administrative procedures to accommodate the new licensure pathways and mobility model. So this would be ensuring that CPAs could seamlessly practice across jurisdictions. So one thing that I kind of want to point out is, with Ohio, they did pass some updated mobility legislation this year. And so as a Colorado CPA, I could go and I could practice in Ohio starting when their bill and their legislation goes into effect on January 1st, 2026, and I would not need an additional license. So that's what we need to think about when we're hearing mobility and it being individually based instead of having it be more about the state and the substantial equivalency. I also want to note that the revised language does provide a safe harbor for CPAs that were licensed under previously approved pathways. So you don't have to worry about having to go back and do anything different if you are a CPA in good standing in a state. So comments on this. Comments you can do by May 3rd, 2025. And if the last exposure and the last proposed changes are any indication of what they are probably going to get, we're likely going to see many comments coming this way. So we do have a link to the comments page down below in the comments. And then you can also go to the UAA's Exposure Draft and reach that form from there. So thank you so much for joining me today as we looked at what happened at the AICPA's 2025 Regional Council meetings and also the UAA's proposed changes in their exposure draft and their CPA licensure and mobility. Thank you so much.